Who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So 8th edition is here, it's mid-2017, and we've left the dark days of 7th edition behind us. Gone are the invisible Death Stars, gone are the Triptide and Wraith Knight abominations, and gone are the Battle Company and War Convocation that gave the armies endless free stuff. Games Workshop promises 8th edition to be the most balanced and reviewed edition of 40k yet, with a brand new overhauled rule set, and with the plotline of Warhammer 40k advancing, thousands and thousands of players flock back to play the game. In this video we'll be taking a look at how the strongest armies of 8th edition have risen and fallen throughout the 2.5 years of its existence. Now, the 8th edition indexes when they came out provided an exciting refresh as everyone scrambles to find what's the good stuff and the new strongest things lie. Games Workshop may have done a fair amount of playtesting, but certain things are rapidly uncovered by the hive mind of the internet, one of the most apparent being that Guard are very strong now. Fearless 50-man conscript blobs can theoretically math to death almost any target with strength 3 last shots. Infantry with plasma guns are at least equal to most units in the game. Very cheap mortar squads can delete most targets on the map, and deep striking scions with plasma can mess up elite targets. Most psychers are fairly underwhelming, but spam is a bit of an issue with cheap psychers, particularly things like astropaths and malefic lords. From the Forge World Renegade and Heretics range, particularly being able to chew through elite armies under a barrage of mortal wounds. The way that detachments are formed, meaning that you don't have to create detachments of one specific codex, so there's not really much incentive not to just soup together the strongest things from each codex, particularly scary units such as Celestine, who can move 24 inches in a turn then charge, become a staple in many Imperium lists. The single strongest model in the entire Eldar range turns out to be a flock of small birds in the Drukhari Razorwing flocks. Some people convert entire armies of these out of cake toppers before Games Workshop rapidly steps in to double the points of them, clearly realising they made an error. For the Space Marines, Storm Raven spam seems to be one of the strongest builds, sometimes backed up with Gilliman, who is also frequently seen leading assault cannon Razorbacks into battle. The Tau seem to have one solid build in spamming commanders and drones and obliterating the enemy with fusion blasters, and Inari seem to have most of their 7th broken rules intact in 8th edition, allowing additional activations and allowing some crazy shenanigans with double shooting Dark Reapers and incredibly mobile Shining Spears. As the first few codexes in 8th start to drop, Mortarion is unleashed alongside his Death Guard as a very scary threat on the battlefield and will often take to the field alongside Magnus in the scary Bash Brothers list. Poxwalkers, through an interesting combination of stratagems, can both be untargetable, and the unit size can grow enormously through reanimating their dead comrades, meaning that a Poxwalker list surrounded by cultists can create a unit that's literally over 100 models strong very easily. The cultists can be very hard to deal with as well, due to Alpha Legion tricks from the new Space Marine Codex and the Tide of Traitors stratagem that can further add to the deadly horde. Add a few Demon Princes to the mix who can't be targeted, and Chaos have some strong options. Next, the Guard Codex drops, providing very large buffs to an army that was already very strong. Conscripts are heavily nerfed and also become 4 points a model, meaning that infantry squads are now the way to go, and Russes gain grinding advance, making them and tank commanders very deadly threats to be on the other side of the table from. The Adeptus Mechanicus Codex sees Castellan robots being one of their strongest builds at the moment. This remains strong for a while but gradually tails off as other armies catch up. Along with Imperial Guard, the Craftworld's Codex is possibly the strongest, giving them far more psychic options and access to the Elatok Craftworld, meaning now everything's far harder to hit, particularly for lower ballistic skill armies such as Guard. The new options also further strengthen Ynnari, who were already fairly strong right off the bat. Dark Reapers, Shining Spears, Eldar Flyers and Fire Prisms are all pretty strong here, and Eldar are set to remain strong for a long time to come with this book. Blood Angels and Tyranids are released late in the year, the BA book mainly adding incredibly fighty characters to the Imperial Soup toolbox, with good old Smash Captain Slamguinius being able to jump out of nowhere and delete almost anything in the game with his high-powered Thunderhammer. The Tyranid Codex provides the Bugs a pretty powerful but short-lived reign of terror, with mass deep-striking flying hive tyrants being very hard for most armies to deal with. The Dark Angels Codex really starts to see the Dark Talons start to come to the fore. They're not the easiest to kill, put out an absolute ton of bolter shots, and the Rift Cannons are no slouch against tanks and armoured targets as well, and lists that spam these have decent answers to virtually anything. In December, the first chapter approved is released, and Games Workshop sets out its plan for balance and errata changes in the future. The majority of points cost adjustments will be once a year in chapter approved, with more minor changes and nerfs to the way that the game is played or certain problem units or stratagems happening twice a year in the big FAQs and erratas. Some of the biggest changes from this particular chapter approved are points hikes on most of the Forge World options, many of the really big heavy units being heftily nerfed to the point where you'd never really take them in a competitive game. Smite spam is also reined in here, with the addition of the Psychic Focus special rule, meaning that you can't just drown an army in mortal wounds from cheap psychers, but this does hit Thousand Sons and Grey Knights particularly hard. January 2018 sees a new and slightly surprising codex drop. The Adeptus Custodes become a full faction in their own right, and gain additional options in the Terminators and also these very scary jet bikes. It's a credible list to just spam nothing but these jet bikes, as between Hurricane Bolters for hordes and decent melee for heavy targets, they very quickly and brutally dispatch a whole load of the toughest options in the game. Shield Captains on Dawn Eagle jet bikes are a very easy addition to most Imperial armies, particularly as you only need to buy one box of jet bikes to be able to fill the 3 that you need, and a lot of Imperial super armies start to pick these up now. A couple of Chaos releases help out the Chaos Demons and Thousand Sons, and we start to see some lists with enormous hordes of Plague Bearers, with anything up to 180 of them in one list, dominating the board for the vast majority of the game and tending to win very heavily on objectives. We can get Thousand Sons casters sheltering behind them, maybe in addition to a Demon Prince with the Axe of Blind Fury to cut down any heavy hitters. At tournaments, very spammy lists are becoming prevalent, particularly things like the aforementioned Hive Tyrants and Dark Talons, and it's not too uncommon to see events being won by these things, sometimes being as many as 8 or 9 of them in the same list. Games Workshop says a big nope to that with the rule of 3, meaning that in a standard 2000 point game you can only run 3 of each datasheet, which makes army list building a lot more interesting, and stops us seeing armies that are literally nothing but copies of the same unit. This FAQ also stops mass turn 1 deep striking, and using that as a way to beta strike your opponent off the table, you can now only drop in turn 2 or turn 3 unless you want to drop inside your deployment zone. Battalions and brigades now give more command points as well. Battalions go up to 5 and brigades to 12. This gives armies such as Blood Angel Smash Captains more command points to play with, and we start to see the Loyal 32, the 2 company commanders and 3 Imperial Guard squads that give 5 command points to another list become quite a frequent feature in army building. As well as this, Dark Talons and Hive Tyrants get their points increased, as does Guilliman, and a few Eldar units too, partly due to the shenanigans of Ynnari. The next releases are for the Xenos. The Necron Codex is unfortunately pretty underwhelming, and Necrons very much remain one of the weakest armies in 8th edition throughout. Following subsequent chapter-approved points drops, people do have some success with them, with Doomsday Arcs and Doom Scythes, but in general the faction as a whole just isn't all that strong. The Tau Codex, on the other hand, certainly breathes a lot of life into the faction. In particular, it feels like a slight return to 7th edition with triple Riptide lists coming back, this time surrounded with shield drones to make them nigh invulnerable to enemy fire. This list remains decently powerful right up to the current meta, just due to having a decent amount of firepower that's nigh invulnerable to enemy shooting. Another Xenos release gives us Drukhari, who go from being generally reasonably underwhelming as a faction to having pretty brutal damage output and actually really quite good durability considering the points costs. Things like Ravagers with 3 Disintegrators backed up with Archons with the Writ of the Living Muse, Razorwing Jet Fighters, Talos spam and Venom spam all have success, and in competitive armies are pretty much always backed up with their allied Farseer to give them Guide and Doom, which makes things like Splinter Rifles and Disintegrators ridiculously efficient against the vast majority of targets. Going into the middle of 2018, we're still seeing a lot of Ynnari about. With these new command point changes, Guard brigades are becoming quite common, particularly things like Kaschan melee focus brigades, with a whole bunch of Kaschan infantry and Ironhand Strachan. These guys give out all their fancy command points to allies, particularly things like Blood Angel Smash Captains and the Shield Captain Custody jet bikes, all of whom enjoy character protection behind all the strong infantry battle line, and we often see things like Hellhounds and artillery, providing a little bit of fire support as well. The codexes for Harlequins, Space Wolves and Deathwatch all come out. Harlequins' biggest impact are their bikers with Haywire, who again synergize very well with Farseers with Guide and Doom, particularly against the upcoming Imperial Knights, which come out very shortly. Unfortunately, Space Wolves, despite having strong melee options, struggle to get into close combat and just aren't all that tough, so never really break through at a competitive level. Deathwatch on the other hand certainly do have some success, usually as allies with things like Imperial Guards. Their special issue ammunition combined with kill teams with Storm Shields and Terminators absolutely murderizes infantry while being quite durable, so provided you can find something to take out tanks for them, then they're generally quite strong. The Imperial Knight Codex really does shake up the meta a lot though. The Knights book releases Castellan and Dominus Knights and revamps the rules for the Armiger Knights that were released in Forgebane. Knights go from being somewhat underwhelming as they've been so far, to scarily efficient powerhouses in the blink of an eye, largely due to their powerful stratagems, such as rotate ion shields and machine spirit resurgence to keep them durable and also functioning at full capacity, and gaining powerful household options, such as extra durability from Tyrannus or extra killing power from Krast. It's not immediately noticed right from the start, at least by most, but Raven Castellans gradually begin to become more and more dominant in the meta. Their stratagem Order of Companions costs 2 command points, but provides an incredible damage buff to the already decent Castellan Knight. Between Call's Wrath and its Volcano Lance, the Castellan Knight crushes basically all other non-knight vehicles out of the meta for a bit, unless they have incredibly strong protection or can hide out of line of sight, as a tooled up Castellan Knight can reliably kill 2 vehicles a turn, possibly even more with good rolls. The advent of Imperial Knights really starts to make Custodes Bikers fall out of fashion, as they don't match up all that well with their slightly lower strength, and Avenger Gatling cannons and things really go through Custodes Bikers pretty efficiently. Late 2018 is a little bit of a slow spell in terms of codex releases. The only codex that's released here is the Orc Codex, which gives the faction a decent strength buff. Deep striking boys with evil sons or using the jump are very powerful, and Orc Looter Death Stars can mob up, form enormous 25 strong units, and then capitalise on the Orcs' decent stratagems to spam out enough strength 7 shots to blow away most targets in the game, or from safe behind grot shields. Another variant strong Orc list is spamming Smasher Guns, where you can easily take 18 of these 30 odd point machines in a list, and they compare very favourably indeed to most other vehicles and even knights in terms of shooting output and durability. Orcs certainly take a fair few tournaments here, and their strong builds never really go away, though they do become a little bit less prevalent as the meta goes on and other strong stuff is released. Eldar flyer lists are becoming a bit more prevalent around this sort of time as well, particularly as they counter knights very well, really blunting their shooting with strong negative to hit modifiers, and Guide and Doom being really potent against big tough Death Star type units such as Imperial Knights, and they're one of the few armies that can reliably take down a Castellan hiding behind a 3+ invul save in one turn. Games Workshop makes an effort to rein in the Castellan in the big FAQ number 2, where it increases the points cost of various knight stratagems, including the Order of Companions, has Tyrannus' ability to make a knight get back up, and the Oathbreaker guidance system missile that allows knights to snipe enemy warlords. Unfortunately, Order of Companions on a Castellan knight remains easily efficient enough to be used when you run it alongside a guard battalion or 2, and the Castellan isn't going anywhere right now. The big FAQ also introduces Tactical Restraint, which limits command point farming, meaning that you can't regenerate quite as many as before, and this sort of makes the Loyal 32 even more valuable as command points become more precious. I think that this does start to take Blood Angel Smash Captains out of the meta a touch, because these guys need even more command points to function on full capacity than the Imperial Knights do. In addition to this, they also add Prepared Positions, which is a nice touch for armies going second, and they tweak the reserve rules to only allow armies to drop turn 2 and turn 3, as some armies such as Dark Eldar were typically reserving all their Ravagers, for example, so they'd be guaranteed safe from a round of shooting, and then turning up within their deployment zone to get an alpha strike on the enemy where they couldn't be shot before. Finally in 2018, Chapter Approved 2018 comes out. The Tau in particular gets some decent points drops, the Broadside in particular comes down a lot of points, and you start to see very scary lists involving 9 Broadside battlesuits turning up, where in general either you reach them and turn their firepower off in close combat, or they hoover everything off the board. Adeptus Mechanicus get some reasonable points cuts in this one, and with their soon-to-be-released Scorpius Disintegrator tank, they start to become just a little bit more credible as a faction, either as part of an Imperial soup army, or in their own right, and Dark Reapers and Shining Spears are nerfed even more, largely due to the excesses of Inari, where now that's the only real viable way to play them. Now into 2019, and the year starts off with the release of the Genestealer Cult Codex, completing the releases for a codex of all of the major factions now. They're a high-scale army to use, but they take several tournaments, with horrendously scary melee threats such as Aberrants and Acolytes lurking out of reach until they're ready to hit, and provided they can punch through screening guardsmen, they are a fairly decent counter to Imperial Knights. The Assassin's Index comes out in a white dwarf, allowing Imperial players to add a reactive assassin to their army for just 1 command point, and with their new and improved abilities, it's generally worth doing, though Games Workshop does nerf this option a little bit in the April FAQ by increasing it to 2 CP, making it a bit more of a choice than an auto-include. Big FAQ 3 drops in April, and in my opinion does a really decent job of fixing some of the things that are strongest in the competitive meta. Castellans are both hit by a points hike, and also a cap to rotate ion shields, meaning that they can only get a 4+ now rather than a 3+. Doom and Jinx are nerfed to only work on Craftworld Eldar, so no more applying this to Talos, Razor Wings and Ravagers, and the Beta Bolter Discipline rule gives Space Marines of all stripes a decent boost, which frankly at this point they sorely need. At around about the same time, Inari are rather brutally cut down from one of the strongest armies in 8th edition, as they've been since the very start, to now a fairly suboptimal way to play Eldar. Rather than scary additional activations, they now focus on combat buffs, meaning that Craftworlds, and particularly Eldar Flyer Spam, seems to be the strongest way to play Eldar now. With the long-awaited fall of the Castellan, vehicles now start to come back into the competitive scene, as very few people were running them at all when you knew they could just be hoovered off the board by a Castellan. And it's honestly a pretty decent thing for varieties of armies seeing the tabletop. The Knight's top build moves on to triple Crusader lists, and these are still pretty strong with Tyrannus or Krast, but not quite as oppressive as the Castellan meta was before, and they're typically also supported by command point batteries in Guard or Admech. Plaguebearer hordes shielding thousands on characters now becomes one of the strongest lists in the game, dominating the centre of the board, hitting enemies with smites from where they can't reach them, and then moving forward to finish them off in assault after they've had a game's worth of being mauled by Plaguebearers and mortal wounds. It's around here that we get the release of the Shadowspear box, including the Primaris Vanguard Space Marines and the new models for the Chaos. The Vanguard Marines are unfortunately somewhat underwhelming on their drop, but we'll be seeing more from them very soon, and on the Chaos side probably the strongest release are the Lord Discordants, who are just decently durable and pretty fighty in melee. The release of the campaign books Vigilist Defiant and Vigilist Ablaze sees some interesting buffs to multiple armies, including things like the Emperor's Wrath Artillery Company and the Hammer of Sunderance for Guard, the Indomitus Crusaders and Veteran Intercessors for Marines, and the souped up shock attack gun for the Orcs. On the Chaos side, they also get an updated codex with Renegade Legion tactics. In particular, Deredeo and Contemptor Dreadnoughts from the Purge put out some pretty decent firepower, often behind Plaguebearer screens again, and the Flawless Host can see Lord Discordants getting a whole ton of attacks on the charge. Hot on the heels of this are yet more goodies for Chaos in the Chaos Knights, bringing the Chaos side somewhat up to the same level as the Loyalists, but I'd argue that the Loyalists are still slightly stronger, but they do provide an interesting tool to Chaos soup lists. And a trio of knights with double thermal cannons can be very scary to face, as they provide some excellent anti-tank ranged firepower, and with some of the boosts from the Chaos Knight book, they can be stomping around almost as strong as a Knight Gallant when they get into close combat. With the Castellan not around to repress everything as much, we start to see quite a lot more vehicles back on the scene, from guard tanks and artillery to Admech Onagers and Scorpius Disintegrators, to Eldar Fire Prisms. In particular, the Forge World Custody tanks, particularly the Caladius tank, is starting to see a lot of play, as it's just very strong in terms of firepower and defence for its points cost, and comes with some handy special rules, such as decent movement, fly, and negative penalties to enemies trying to charge it. When the rules are finalised for the Caladius, it does see a nerf both to its main cannon and points cost however, though it remains decently strong. And then we have Space Marines, who hit the meta like an absolute ton of bricks. The updated Marine Codex comes out alongside the Invicta Tactical Warsuit and the multi-part versions of the Vanguard Marines that we saw in Shadowspear. Auto Discipline is still here, along with Shock Assault and all new combat doctrines that increase the AP of Space Marine weapons. On top of this, many Marine choices also go down in points as well, as Games Workshop quite clearly wants to turn them from one of the bottom factions into one of the top ones, and they certainly succeed in this. I'd argue that with the base codex it was actually a reasonably balanced job of doing so. I wouldn't necessarily have been too overpowered, but unfortunately for the state of the meta, we have some supplement books on the way. Particularly strong units include the Invicta Tactical Warsuit, Eliminators, who with their new and improved stat line are very, very cost efficient for the firepower that they put out, even when they're not targeting characters who they remove with ease. Gravitic Amplification allows GravDev drop pods to melt enemy tanks and vehicles straight out of reserve turn 1 due to the updated drop pod rules. and Chaplain Dreadnoughts see a massive new lease of life as they gain all these buffs plus new litanies, making them decent buffing machines as well as decent melee and fire sport damage dealers. Leviathan Dreadnoughts, already one of the stronger units for Codex Space Marines, go absolutely through the roof, with additional AP for combat doctrines and Duty Eternal making them near unkillable. Centurions throw out hideous amounts of bolt shots with a new bolter discipline and higher AP bonus, as do aggressors, and Thunderfire Cannons are very efficient ignores line of sight weapons, and between them and Whirlwinds, they also become the premier ignores line of sight faction, I'd argue even beating out the Imperial Guard. The Space Marines very much have the tools to take on the current meta. Their new and upgraded Chapter Master wording means that they can take out Eldar flyers with relative ease, having high ballistic skill and full rerolls to get a lot of hits on the targets. The same goes for Plague Bearer lists, where they can both put out a ton of bolt shots, and also with full reroll hits it means a lot of them are connecting, meaning that even the incredibly sturdy Plague Bearers just aren't quite efficient screens enough, and the list becomes far less prevalent. Genestealer cults are also having a massively hard time against the new Marines, in no small part due to Auspex scan, meaning that the Marine units with the high amount of bolter shots can blow their scary deep strike threats off the table before they even get to do anything, and infiltrators can also stop them from getting anywhere near the Marine lines in the first place. All of this is very strong and certainly catapults Marines right to the top tier, but unfortunately Games Workshop very rapidly doubles down on this with the release of these supplement books. The Ultramarines and White Scar books add super doctrines, which give the Marines an extra layer of buffs over the ones that they already had, and very powerful ones at that. But it's when the Iron Hand supplement comes out that things reach a new level of crazy, with their super doctrine allowing them to move and fire heavy weapons with no penalty, and also gives Army Rise reroll once to hit, meaning that you don't even need to invest in all that many HQ buffs. Everything just functions brutally efficiently no matter where it is on the table, allowing murderous firepower with extremely flexible movement, and the supplement book has all manner of other decent tricks as well, including Ironfather Pyros's 5+ invul save bubble that makes Propulsor Executioners near invulnerable, particularly when equipped with the Ironstone, that can also make a whole cluster of them -1 damage, and just near impossible to kill. They also have great options for Psychic Denial, ludicrously strong Overwatch, and stacking shenanigans that can heal vehicles anything up to 9 wounds per turn. They're very much like nothing that we've ever seen. Raven Guard also drop at the same time, and while not being absolutely on the same level as Iron Hands, they're still arguably stronger than virtually anything else in the game at the moment, with being able to deep strike Centurions, meaning that you can have scary assault Centurions with siege guns coming out of nowhere, hosing you with bolter shots, and then deleting your heavy hitters with those enormous siege drills. Following on from this, Games Workshop releases Blood of the Phoenix and Phoenix Rising, which gives some marginal buffs to Craftworlds and Drukhari. Unfortunately, the releases in the Blood of the Phoenix box are somewhat underwhelming from a competitive point of view, but the new book certainly does help out the Craftworlds, with new Exarch traits and the ability for expert crafters and masterful shots, which seems to become the vogue for new Craftworlds lists, who tend to be leaning away from a Laytok now that Chapter Masters counter it so well. Games Workshop does react relatively promptly to the Iron Hands situation that they've created, going against their normal balance updating schedule to give the army multiple nerfs in a specific tailored FAQ. The Ironstone now only affects one vehicle, and Pharos's aura doesn't affect vehicles as well, helping break up the Repulsor Executioner castle type list that we'd seen, and limit some of their other shenanigans, such as repeatedly stacking heals on vehicles, but it doesn't prove enough to rein in the faction, with near enough every tournament either being won by Iron Hands or having Iron Hands lists in the top 3. The Salamanders and Imperial Fist supplements come out as well. Out of the two, Imperial Fists makes the most waves with its additional damage to vehicles while in their scary Devastator doctrine, allowing them to absolutely chew through enemy armour, and we start to see entire lists of artillery Imperial Fists, whose Thunderfire Cannons and Whirlwinds can delete virtually any target on the board that they choose to, infantry or vehicle. Following all this, Faith and Fury drops, rather unfortunately giving Marines yet more buffs in things like boosted Chaplains with the Master of Sanctity, and a Tech Marine that can add +1 to the hit rolls of all vehicles, which frankly only makes the Iron Hands and Imperial Fist situation even worse. Black Templars also come out with this. They have some tricks, but they're not quite on the same level as some of the other scary supplements, and there are some tricks for Chaos Marines too, particularly Alpha Legion gaining a ton of scary stratagems, and Chaos in general are able to put some very scary little combos together on the battlefield. Chapter Approved drops later, giving some decent points boosts for a lot of armies, including absolutely tons for Chaos, making things like their Obliterators and Possessed very strong indeed, and we start to see things like Obliterators and Possessed bombs taking advantage of rules that prevent the unit from being targeted, particularly when running behind something like a Lord Discordant that can be up to -4 to hit. The 29 chapter approved generally tends to help out most armies, with decent points drops largely on either core units or units that haven't been used all that much in the majority of factions, though notably things like Dark Eldar Ravagers, Eldar Flyers, Genestealer Cults, Thousand Sons Princes and Zangors, and Plague Bearers are all hit quite hard, becoming just that little bit less viable. This chapter approved really makes obvious that it was written around about 6 months ago before it goes to the printer, and it honestly would have been a pretty decent update if it had come out at that point, but as basically all of these lists were sort of being killed by Space Marines in the first place, it's not such a great update. Finally for 2019, Blood of Baal comes out, giving the Tyranids a few bits and bobs but nothing absolutely groundbreaking, which is a shame really because they've been kind of struggling since their Flying Hive Tyrants were reined in, but it does give some powerful options to Blood Angels, including combat doctrines, and most importantly a buffed Red Thirst that gives them +1 to charges, meaning that we now start to see this with a fair bit of Sanguinary Guard or Death Company in, jumping out of reserve to tear up the opponent in a good Blood Angels fashion. Because of their Assault Doctrine not being quite as important, Blood Angels work quite well when comboed with other Space Marine armies to provide a little bit of shooting or first turn pressure before the Angels jump in. We're now getting pretty much up to the present day as of the recording of this video, where we're starting to look at early 2020. Not all of these updates have had much chance to see exactly what they're capable of yet, so this is a tiny bit speculative compared with the rest. However, Ritual of the Damned was released in January, giving Dark Angels doctrines and new toys, certainly making them stronger, but their doctrines buff is rather short-lived. Thousand Sons get a minor buff, as I believe this rule set was still probably written with their old performance with Nurgle Plaguebearer lists in mind, but the real winners of this book are the Grey Knights, who have, since their release of a codex very early in 8th, have been arguably the weakest army in all of 8th. With the addition of their Tides of the Warp, a new psychic discipline, and some incredibly powerful new stratagems, they go rapidly from being one of the worst armies in 8th to having one of the strongest builds in Grey Knight Paladins backed up by characters. I think they are somewhat shoehorned into this build, as a lot of their other stuff isn't all that great, the other exception maybe being Nemesis Dread Knight Grandmasters, but they've certainly been having some success in tournaments already. The Las Vegas Open sees Raven Guard duke it out against Iron Hands in the final, with an Iron Hands variant involving Chaplain Dreads and the Leviathan Dreadnought backed up by Intercessors, triumphing overall. I suspect directly influenced by this tournament, Games Workshop chooses not to wait until the Spring Balance update to make some changes, drastically changing Space Marine combat doctrines in an errata. You now can't remain in Devastator doctrine all game, as the Iron Hands and Imperial Fists would ideally like to do. You're forced to move on to Tactical and then Assault. This is a massive deal for some of the core Iron Hands builds, including their Vehicle Spam and Air Force, and it certainly puts a massive dent in Imperial Fist artillery lists. They also slightly nerfed Duty Eternal, making it not stack with the Ironstone, fixed Cogitated Martyrdom to stop Dreadnoughts being tanked wounds for by durable Intercessors, and stop Raven Guard throwing Centurions up the board turn 1. Despite all this, it still looks like Iron Hands and Raven Guard are probably at the top of the Space Marine meta, with durable Iron Hands Intercessors, backed up by Iron Father Phyros and the Chief Apothecary from Faith and Fury, making a horde of ridiculously durable bodies that's almost impossible to shift off the table. The Raven Guard can still deep strike their Centurions, so not a whole load has changed for them except that they have to come in turn 2 rather than turn 1. Following this, the next couple of Psychic Awakening books drop, including The Greater Good and Saga of the Beast. The Greater Good gives some small buffs to Guard, almost nothing for the Genestealer Cults unfortunately from a competitive level, but some decent upgrades to Tau, who I do think are going to be one of the strongest armies in the meta going forwards. Both their Riptides and Broadsides saw some solid buffs with this supplement, and there are multiple decent options for making Crisis suits more viable again, which at least would be decent for seeing some variety in Tau lists. As for Saga of the Beast, the Space Wolves, and a little bit more decent close combat material for their characters, in addition to getting combat doctrines, it's very early days yet, but I'd suspect that this isn't going to change a whole ton for them, as they're still going to ever struggle to make it to combat without getting shot off the board. The Orcs buffs largely fell on units that weren't the strongest out of their list at the moment, the exception being their Mech Gun list getting a massive buff out of the Grots subculture, essentially gaining reroll 1s to hit and 6-up invul for free, making the big 18 Mech Gun detachment more viable than ever. Their custom jobs and new stratagems also gave them some reasonable options, particularly focused around some of their vehicles. We'll have to see if they're strong enough to break through and make any further impact in tournaments later in the year, presuming some start to happen again after the current virus-related situation starts to calm down a bit. So I hope you've enjoyed that little history lesson through 8th edition. I'm sure there'll be bits and bobs that I've missed along the way. Feel free to fill in any gaps in the comments below if you think I've omitted something major. It's been fun to have a look over where the game's been recently though. and I'm certainly looking forward to where it's going with the next few book releases and Games Workshop's big reveals that they're going to be doing online these days. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where we have regular 40k content coming every day. And if you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon page. It's what keeps the videos coming, so if you'd be interested in helping support the future creation of videos for the channel, then please check out the link in the description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.